throws me off a bit. So anyway, I'm really happy to be here. Hi, everybody. Looking forward to talking to you about the case of the crime of ecocide. So how we thought we would do this is as follows. Do you see? Yeah.
Yeah, this works.
Yeah, this works. Great. So this is how it's going to go. I'm going to do the first part, which is talking about the law. So we'll go through, what is international criminal law, the history of ecocide, why do we want to make ecocide an international crime, and then how would it work in practice, and which acts would amount to ecocide. And then Jojo is going to take over and talk about action with those topics that you can see. There. I feel like the screen keeps switching from showing you a nice presentation to showing you all the slides. Is that right?
It is actually, because right now we are again seeing the whole PowerPoint.
Okay. Yeah. Let me just see if I can.
Were you clicking on it or using the left and right arrows?
Yeah, I'm just trying to.
Now it works.
It works.
Right. But now it's again on the PowerPoint.
It seems to be impossible for me to do anything but have it as my full screen, which is maybe problematic. Let me see. Okay, I think we might have to just have it like this at the moment. I'm going to start with what is international criminal law. So, and bear with me, I know we've got a range of different expertise in the audience with the participants here. So if I go over, I'm sure I will go over things that some of you are very familiar with already. But I just briefly wanted to touch on, what is international criminal law? So international criminal law essentially is a crime that transcends national borders, right? So it's this idea that whereas criminal law is usually the province of states that decide what is going to be unacceptable in their territory and they're going to punish it, international criminal law comes out of the idea that there are some crimes that cannot be left to individual states to determine. And obviously that comes from particularly the Holocaust and the events of Nazi Germany during World War II, where many of the internationally criminal acts were entirely legal in Nazi Germany. And as you know, there was a trial against the judges and the legal system. So the idea is that, coming out of the Second World War and the Holocaust is this idea that there are some acts that are actually a crime against all of us. So we cannot leave them to individual states. So we can't trust individual states to criminalize them. We, as a global community, we're going to say, this is, beyond the pale and it's a crime. That's the sort of the fundamental idea about international criminal law. And as you know, after World War II, we had the two big instances of international criminal law at Nuremberg and Tokyo, which introduced notions like crimes against humanity, punished war crimes, which already existed. And in fact, there were, as you'll probably be familiar, all sorts of trials that were held by the Allied powers also under these laws. But it really was born out of World War II, right? After the Second World War and after these various trials had played out, the idea of international crimes and developing the framework of international crimes was folded into the new United Nations, and there was a project to draft a code of crimes against the peace and security of mankind. So a sort of consensual move, because the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals were very much imposed on, oh great, thank you for sharing that. So we're actually on the next slide. What is international criminal law now? Thank you so much. So Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals were imposed, as we know, on basically the parties that lost World War II. But then there was this new United Nations body and an attempt to together craft a code of crimes which the global community decided were beyond the pale and were crimes against the peace and security of mankind. That language, peace and security, by the way, you'll recognise as UN language. So the Security Council is empowered to maintain international peace and security. That was very much kind of front of mind for nations emerging from the Second World War. But then again, as you are very familiar with, what happened, the Cold War, all that cooperation which led to Tokyo, led to Nuremberg, led to the creation of the United Nations, stalled, and global progress stalled along with it, and so did the project to draft this Code of Crimes against Peace and Security. What we saw at the end of the Cold War then, fast forwarding to the end of the 80s, 1990s, was this unprecedented period, or this new period of cooperation, which hadn't been seen before. And it was in that period that international justice again got a bit of oxygen, and we had the creation of the ad hoc criminal tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in 1993, in the middle of that ongoing conflict. And we hear from people that were in those discussions. Madeleine Albright, who was the US representative on the Security Council at the time, talks about how this resolution, I mean, it was just a Security Council resolution, a piece of paper that said it was going to create a court. No one actually thought it was going to create a court. It was a gesture. You know, they didn't know what to do, basically, about this war that was going on in Europe. And having done that, you know, they felt that they had to also create a court for this terrible genocide that was unfolding in 1994, the next year in Rwanda. So you had the Rwanda Tribunal. The energy that emerged from these two courts, which, due to many of the outstanding people who were involved in those courts in the early days, actually became real institutions, revitalized international criminal law, really helped these background UN moves towards draft international crime. And then in 1998, the Rome Statute was agreed for the International Criminal Court. So that whole vision of an international criminal court, which had been given birth to with Nuremberg and Tokyo, you know, happened. So in 2002, that came into force, and we now have the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court as our main document in international criminal law. One of the main features of international criminal law, which is really important, is this idea, as I said, one of the driving forces, so there was the idea of a crime that transcends national borders, but it's also a crime that can be prosecuted anywhere, because these are crimes against all of us. So they transcend the usual idea of territory for national crimes. So that has been very useful, and you will have seen many examples of this, what's known as universal jurisdiction. The most famous first one was with Augustus Pinochet, the Chilean dictator, who was extradited from, or whose extradition was granted at least, from the UK to Spain for crimes committed in Chile. And this will come back to this in the context of ecocide, element of international crimes. That's really very key, why they're so useful. Okay, if we move on to the next chunk, is about the history of ecocide. So what about, I've given you the big swathe of international criminal law. What about ecocide itself? Is this a new idea? And you know, the answer is no, it's not. There has been a conversation about international criminal law and the protection of the environment, whether or not under the term ecocide, for a long time. I think the first mention of ecocide that I found was back in 1973. Professor Richard Falk, wrote about it in response to the Vietnam War and the use of Agent Orange and napalm, suggesting that acts that were intended to disrupt or destroy a human ecosystem should be criminalized as ecocide. And importantly, he suggested that these acts would be crimes in times of war and in peacetime. This idea got some traction, and there are a couple of developments in the 70s. The first additional protocol to the Geneva Convention in 1977 actually introduced a war crime of causing widespread, long-term and severe damage to the natural environment. And that same language was included in another convention the year after, just in a slightly different form, but still with those three terms: widespread, long-term and severe damage, in the 70s. But that's in the context of war, right? So that was environmental damage in the context of war. And as I said, the incentive for Richard Falk's idea, even though he thought the crime should exist in peace, was the Vietnam War. So it was really those kind of acts that people had in mind, not so much what we're thinking about today in terms of climate change and industrial destruction of our environment. In the 80s, there was a suggestion that the definition of genocide be expanded to include environmental destruction. And in 1991, a very influential body back at the UN, so these same groups that had been working on the draft code of crimes against peace and security, actually included the idea of a crime of massive harm to the environment, not using the term ecocide. And again, they suggested that that might be a crime in times of war and in times of peace. And what we can gather from reading the commentaries of some of the lawyers and diplomatic representatives involved in those negotiations was that that was dropped from the draft 4 years later in 1995, mainly as a result of opposition from nuclear states who thought that their acts might be criminalized were they to use nuclear weapons. However, the idea of keeping destruction of the environment as a war crime stayed alive in this code. And in fact, as you'll know, in the 1998 statute, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, it's there. So that idea of widespread, long-term and systematic damage to the environment in times of war is a crime now currently at the International Criminal Court, only in times of warfare. So moving to the ecocide story this century, the person who really picked this idea up and ran with it and modernized it to our current context in terms of thinking about how it should adapt, how it should address the kinds of environmental threats that we're facing today was, of course, Polly Higgins, Jojo's former colleague, who I also knew. So Polly Higgins did a massive amount to popularize this idea of ecocide and suggest the urgency of making that an international crime. And she presented her own suggested draft. There were also a couple of efforts, very important efforts in France. Valérie Cabanès drafted a long suggested amendment to the Rome Statute now, so really focusing on the International Criminal Court, and someone called Laurence Neyret, who's written a fantastic, he was the head of a project. He'd written a fantastic book. I always show it because I feel like it's underappreciated in English language circles. A multi-year, multidisciplinary project, which actually drafted a whole separate convention on ecocide and eco-crimes. And all of these efforts, of course, we'll be drawing on in our current efforts to draft a crime that the International Criminal Court could use. So I wanted to talk now briefly about what the implications are of making ecocide an international crime. So we can go on to the next slide, Anya. Thank you. Why an international crime? We've talked already about the idea of international crimes being something that are crimes against all of us. And I think that sort of almost moral aspect of condemnation is a really important one. So the idea that ecocide is a crime of similar gravity to a crime like genocide or crimes against humanity, I think is really important for us globally to acknowledge and to memorialize. And speaking tactically as well, and we can talk about this a lot more in the Q&A, of course, the idea of criminalizing anything has got to be prevention, right? Even the idea of punishing the crime is about deterrence and prevention. So we're not interested in putting people in prison. We're interested in halting climate change and saving our environment. And in my view, we've seen what big fines do to the major industries that are harming our planet. In terms of how much they affect their behavior, they don't seem to have much impact, right? They're just written into the balance sheet. I think if individuals who are running big industries are at risk, not only of potentially being sent to prison, but of even being accused of committing an international crime, my sense is that would have a really deterrent effect. Companies and businesses are very conscious of their image, and I think linking destruction of the environment to international crimes, that whole narrative, I think, could be important in a number of ways. Briefly then, also, there's this issue of universal jurisdiction, which I mentioned, which is hugely important. So an international crime can be prosecuted anywhere. the states can implement that legislation, but the notion of an international crime is that it can be prosecuted anywhere. So that means, I mean, as we know, much environmental destruction happens in weak states where the authorities are, you know, often not in a position to prosecute or to hold accountable the big industries that are damaging their own environments. However, if ecocide is an international crime, any state can prosecute. And in terms of the structure of the International Criminal Court, that really means, it's, as we'll talk about later, that would be based on nationality or on territory. But these crimes can be prosecuted outside the situation of the country actually being committed. And then I think shifting, so I mentioned some of the legal actions that are already going on against the big polluters. We see all sorts of creative actions. There's some really exciting things happening. I'm sure many of you are aware of them, if not involved in them yourselves. So all these fantastic actions, these crimes against future generations actions that are happening, you know, here in the US, but also across the world, really creative uses of current law to sue big companies. Those depend on the plaintiffs having the resources to launch those legal actions, right? If you shift it to criminal law, it's no longer on the victims. The responsibility and the financial burden is no longer on the victims. It shifts to the states. The states will then prosecute. And I think that's another really useful element of shifting this to international criminal law. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So how would it work? And here I'm talking about the project that Jojo and I are engaged in, and that is to amend the Rome Statute to include a crime of ecocide. So how does the Rome Statute work? Just in 5 minutes. Well, there are currently 4 crimes that can be prosecuted at the International Criminal Court. Genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and a recent addition, the crime of aggression. So this would be a 5th crime, the crime of ecocide. The basic principle of the Rome Statute is the principle of complementarity, as it's called. And that is this notion that when a state signs the statute, it's not signing up to send every instance of an international crime to be tried in The Hague. Quite the opposite. It's actually committing to prosecute those crimes in its own domestic jurisdiction. So it's committing to make those crimes, those 4 crimes, current 4 crimes in the statute, crimes in its own country if they're not already, and to prosecute them. The International Criminal Court is a court of last resort. So the court in The Hague only steps in when the national authorities who would normally have jurisdiction over the crimes, are either unable or unwilling to prosecute. So that's very important to bear in mind, because the International Criminal Court itself obviously cannot deal as a matter of logistics with all of those crimes, but it also may be more effective for a number of reasons to have the crimes being prosecuted in different national jurisdictions around the world. Jurisdiction is based on territory or nationality. So in other words, if the UK signs up, I'm from the UK, if the UK signs up to the International Criminal Court, it gives the court jurisdiction over crimes committed in its territory or under its territorial jurisdiction, I should say, and also by its nationals, so by UK nationals. So just to jump outside of that for a second, I mean, some of you will be aware of the current tussle between the United States and the International Criminal Court. The United States is not signed up to the Rome Statute, and is, at least President Trump was pretty annoyed that the prosecutor announced she would be investigating the actions of US military and members of the CIA in Afghanistan. And, you know, the people opposing that in the US are like, we're not members of the court. How can you investigate, you know, our troops or our Secret Service officials? And the answer is the territory of Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a party to the court. So anything that happens on the territory of Afghanistan is under the court's jurisdiction. It doesn't matter the nationality of the people. That will be very familiar to all of you, because of course that's how territorial jurisdiction works anyway. We all know that if we go abroad to a different country and commit a crime, we can be held responsible under the jurisdiction of that state, and it's the same principle at the ICC. There's one other way that the International Criminal Court can have jurisdiction, and that is if the Security Council, the UN Security Council, refers a situation to the court, and that has to be under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. In other words, it has to be in the face of a threat to international peace and security, and it has to be a measure intended to restore international peace and security. And that's happened twice so far, in the case of Darfur and in the case of Libya. So neither of those states were parties to the court, and the Security Council resolved to refer the situation to the court to investigate it. So all of those provisions that I'm going through now would apply to a crime of ecocide. That's why I'm going through them, because I think you can already see that there are a number of ways that different situations of ecocide could come before the court. There are two other things that that are very important for a case to come before the court. First of all, there's this issue of complementarity. So the court can reject a case if a state says, no, we're prosecuting it. And if that's backed up, right, they can investigate to a certain amount. So if a state says, no, we'll investigate that, then the court doesn't have jurisdiction. That's this principle of complementarity. And there's an example with the UK again. So the court opens an investigation, the prosecutor opens an investigation into the action of UK troops in Iraq. And the response of the UK government was to say, yeah, good point, we'll deal with that. And so the prosecutor is not able to prosecute it while the UK is investigating that. So that's one dynamic. And the other filter for a case to be admissible is gravity. These cases have to be extremely serious, and that's in the statute of the court itself. And if this case is not sufficiently serious, the prosecutor will not proceed with the investigation. Okay, last couple of points. Who is liable? Who is able to be prosecuted at the court? Individuals. It's individual criminal responsibility. So we're looking at people, not companies. So if we're talking about a crime of ecocide, we have to realize that it wouldn't be like an oil company that is prosecuted. It would be individuals, further to the theories of individual criminal responsibility. So it would be those most responsible. So we might want to think about, CEOs or board members and so on. And finally, there is potential for compensation to victims at the International Criminal Court. Now, this hasn't worked terribly well so far, but it is there. It's written into the statute. And there are two ways in which victims can get compensation. And this obviously is important for ecocide. One is by showing that they're a victim of the specific crime that has been prosecuted, but there's also a trust fund for victims, which was set up with the idea to compensate victims of international crimes in a more general way. So without you having to prove that you were directly affected by a particular crime. So that's something else to bear in mind. Okay, I'm just wrapping up now with the last point. What acts would amount to ecocide? Well, this is the question. There's no answer to that at the moment, because that's exactly what we're working on with the panel. But there are a couple of things we know. If we're talking about ecocide as a crime at the International Criminal Court, first of all, it has to be of a level of extreme gravity, because that's the structure of the court, and there are already provisions in the statute explaining that it's only crimes of the most severe nature and concern to humanity that will be prosecuted by the court, as I explained. What will that gravity requirement look like? I don't know. We've got some legal elements that we could look at in the panel. I mean, I should say as well that whatever definition we come up with as a panel will not necessarily be the definition that ends up in the statute, of course. That will be for the states parties to discuss. But we're going to come up with something that is a strong, plausible option for them. I mentioned the qualifier widespread, long-term and severe that's been used in a number of these international criminal law provisions to protect the environment. It might be that language is useful. It might be that we can find something else which is more appropriate. We will definitely be drafting something that is applicable both in times of conflict and in times of peace. So unlike the current provision, which is only applicable in times of war, and it will apply to individuals, not to companies, because that's the framework of the statute. One of the big questions that we need to think about is whether the crime will require proof of harm to humans. So the whole assumption behind this project, of course, is that destruction of the environment does cause human harm. I mean, that we are, I mean, at least this is my vision of it, we're all interdependent part of a system, right? So it cannot be that the environment is damaged and that's irrelevant to humans. But is it going to be necessary to actually make it about humans, which most of the crimes in the statute currently are? Or will it be possible to expand that and to have a crime of damaging the environment in itself? And some of the previous drafts that I mentioned earlier do take that approach. For example, the war crime of destroying the environment, there's no reference to the fact that that has to affect humans. I mean, I think that's just understood. It's an assumption that's in there. And lastly, one of the things that will really be, is a big challenge, and I'd love to get your input on this, is going to be how to capture climate change, which obviously is the driving force behind our initiative and one of the main, one of the, is the thing that we feel we have to halt, not the only thing, but really the major thing, but particularly hard to capture in international criminal law because of its systemic nature. So I'd love to talk about that. And now I think we can open up for questions to me or to Jojo for the next, let's say, 15 minutes. Okay, let's have a look at the questions.
Well, there are lots of questions, Kate, and we've been putting them down for you. One of them from Luke Johnson is, who would have legal standing to bring ecocide cases?
Yeah, okay, great question. Thanks, Luke. So within the structure of the International Criminal Court, there are 3 ways that a case can be brought, that the prosecutor can start investigating the case. And I'm really glad you asked, because I totally should have addressed that. So one is that the prosecutor herself can investigate a case proprio motu, on her own motion. So that is, I mean, if she wants to do that, she investigates a case, she has discretion to open, to have a preliminary examination. Before she can properly start investigating and get all the resources of her office behind her, she needs the approval of a panel of judges. So the states put that in because they were scared the prosecutor would go, haywire and start prosecuting them all. So they put some judges in. So there's a filter, but the prosecutor can start cases herself. So when we hear about things like the complaint that was issued against Bolsonaro, yesterday, or any of the other complaints that are sent to the court, that's what happens. Anybody can write to the prosecutor and allege a crime within the jurisdiction of the court. And then there's a section of the prosecutor's office which reads that stuff and says, yeah, I think maybe we should have a little look into this one, or no, that's so that's one way. There are 2 other ways. One is that a state can refer a case, and that's actually happened a lot. Interestingly, states have mainly referred themselves. So states that have some kind of internal conflict have referred, like, the other party to the court, the insurgents. That would be like the case of Uganda, for example. And the third way is the referral from the Security Council in case of a threat to international peace and security.
Thanks, Kate. We also have a question from Natalie. Could you please address the relevancy of intent, that is, intent to destroy, as a key element in decisions to prosecute?
Absolutely, yeah. Intent is a big issue. So in terms of the crime that we're crafting, intent will be one of the things that we need to think about. But actually, intent is also something which has already been defined in the Rome Statute. So Article 30 of the Rome Statute sets out the intent for all of the crimes in the Rome Statute. So any crime of ecocide that we come up with will be governed by that. And I haven't got Article 30 right in front of me, but it's divided into 2 parts. It talks about the actions and the consequences. There has to be intent, and the language may not be exactly right, but you can check Article 30. In terms of the actions undertaken, there has to be intent to commit those actions. And in terms of the consequences, there has to be either intent that those consequences will occur, or knowledge that they will occur in the ordinary course of events. So that's very important for us, because where we will obviously be talking about acts, deliberate acts, which result in environmental damage. If there is knowledge on the part of the perpetrator that that environmental damage will occur in the ordinary course of events, that is the requisite intent for guilt under the Rome Statute. Some of the crimes introduce extra elements of intent, and your question seemed to me to be referring to that and to the intent that exists in the crime of genocide. So that would be the intent to destroy in whole or in part, you know, a national, racial, etc. group. That's specific to the crime of genocide, and that's written into that specific article of the Rome Statute. We could propose some extra intent if we thought that that was relevant in the draft, but whatever we do will be guided by that Article 30 that I described, which I think is, you know, is not too problematic for a crime of ecocide.
Thanks, Kate. We have lots of questions, so lots more coming at you. We have one from Rachel. If not connected to human harm, could you envisage or envision legal representation for non-human victims?
I love that question. Oh, I mean, so I love this topic. The rights of nature I think is really fascinating, and yeah, I love it. I would love to I would love to answer yes. I mean, I can certainly envision it, but I think it's a way down the road. I mean, the structure, the way the court works, right, that victims can be represented in the court to a certain extent, you know, so in that sense, it's a little bit more like a civil law system where victims actually do have standing, but it's very prosecutor driven. I mean, so the court doesn't need to have victims per se in the court. I mean, it needs evidence, obviously, so it needs witnesses, but it's more like, you know, it can be driven without the victim. So it's not like a, you know, a civil claim where it's the victim claiming against the perpetrator. And it's also, as I said, not as strong, perhaps, as a civil or penal system where the victims are represented, although there is some standing. So it's not necessary to have nature represented in the courtroom, but oh my goodness, I just love that idea. I think I'm going to have to think about this a bit more, Rachel. I think I really like this. I think that would be fantastic.
I'm seeing some of the questions that have a bit of a political slant, which I think Jojo might be better placed to answer. So I'm just trying to pick out the ones that are squarely within the legal domain. Earlier on, John Ames had asked, he had raised the issue of the usual principles in criminal law that crimes will not be retroactively applied. How does that play out in the context of ecocide and what we're trying to do here at the International Criminal Court level?
Yeah, that's a great question, and obviously hugely relevant for a number of reasons. I mean, we're finding out more and more about, you know, what the carbon majors knew and what they did, and surely that should be criminal, but it's not going to fall under any new crime, unfortunately, because of course there is the principle of legality and non-retroactivity. So it's only going to be acts from the time that the new law comes into force that can be prosecuted. Although of course we can think about continuing crimes, you know, so crimes that may have started before and continue afterwards. The other issue that brings up, and that's something which I think we're going to need to think about very carefully in crafting the definition, is the issue which is raised in all the climate negotiations about about the historic burden of guilt, and you know, how do we deal with the fact that historically the emissions have been created by the global north, and yet if we were to bring in a crime right now, you know, it looks like we'll be penalising global south countries who are dependent, who are arguing, as they do in the climate negotiations, so hang on a minute, you guys all did your economic development through, you know, this particular process, and now what, like, we're not allowed to. It looks like a kind of colonial imposition. So I think, I mean, this is something that we've been thinking about right from the very beginning, and it's something that's been dealt with within the framework of the Paris Agreement with this common but differentiated responsibilities principle. And I think we're going to have to think about what that might look like in international criminal law. You know, I don't see any easy answer, but I think it's something that we'll have to think about in terms of, you know, for a number of reasons, for reasons of equity, for reasons of political support, right? Because I think that could easily be a locus for objection or resistance to the introduction of the crime.
Thanks, Kate. We're not going to get through all of the questions because we do want to go on to Jojo, and then we will have a more general and try to pick up all the other questions at that time. But you can join the WhatsApp group where we'll be continuing the discussions, and Jojo and Kate are part of that WhatsApp group, so we can answer all of the questions then. But yeah, we have some really interesting questions that I see coming up on the campaigning side, which I'm sure Jojo is about to share a lot more on, and we'll go deeper into it. Thanks so much, Kate, for giving an introduction to the legal context for the crime of ecocide. And turn it over to Jojo.
Thank you so much. And perhaps, Anya, if you perhaps oblige with the slides again, that would be great. And it's the procedure and possibility is the first one of those. So I think I'd probably start by looking at what is the actual kind of process for ecocide becoming a crime at the International Criminal Court, and that has 4 main stages. So the first stage is proposal, which would be when a state or a group of states actually proposes a specific amendment to the text of their own statute. And the power of that is that it creates a kind of horizon on, from which this law is approaching. So I mentioned this briefly in the introductory section, but I think this is very important because it shows the corporate world, and it also, perhaps even more importantly, shows the world of investment that something new is coming, that a new ground rule is approaching. And, we do take this approach, certainly the Stop Ecocide campaign takes this approach, and I think more and more other people in various different sectors are doing this, is understanding that this rule is approaching, it is coming. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And in fact, Polly Higgins had a conversation with one of the key reinsurance companies some years ago. That's the people who insure the insurers. And the representative from this company said to her, "We know this is coming. It's just a question of when it happens." And I think that was around 2012. And it tends to be, the insurance industry often sees things coming before others because they're the ones that are underwriting the activities that these corporations are involved in. So, it's already a flag on the horizon, if you like. And once a proposal is actually put in to the International Criminal Court, that kind of cements that trajectory as being on its way. So that's a hugely important stage. And it has to be done via the UN Secretary General. It has to be submitted to them so that it can then be distributed to all the member states. And there has to be a gap of a certain length of time before, to enable them all to know about it before it's discussed. And I think the other impact of that is really important that Kate touched on already is that unlike the other international crimes, ecocide has a particular effect in the corporate world in the sense of just the criminalizing corporate activity has a certain effect because corporations depend on public confidence for their value and to function. And of course, you can just look at a case like Enron and the fraud situation. A company's stock will collapse very quickly if the CEOs are criminal or accused of crimes. And so putting this on the horizon for corporates has a very important effect because your average CEO cares very deeply what the public think of them. So they're going to be looking at very carefully about what they choose to engage in. And then the second stage, and you'll notice that I'm kind of giving the implications in terms of the sort of practical and cultural implications. These not just looking at the legal side, but the second stage is a sort of admissibility stage. So at the next kind of meeting of the Assembly of States Parties, which is the annual assembly of the members of the International Criminal Court, that it would need to be voted onto the table, so to speak, by at least half of those present. And the structure of the International Criminal Court is very important in this, because it's a one state, one vote structure. And what that means is that a group of small islands can have more power than, you know, a single large economy. And so it becomes very exciting when you look at the possibilities for how one can gather support for this. And it also is important in regard to the fact that, you know, even if some of the bigger economies are potentially not immediately in support, with a large enough number of smaller states to take it forward, it can actually be brought onto the table for discussion. So that's very exciting. The third stage is, of course, the meat of the adoption of the crime, and that is a period during which the states parties and representatives will be discussing the text that has been put forward and potentially negotiating it. And there, you know, one may well end up with a specific dedicated conference for that, as happened with the crime of aggression with the Kampala Agreement. And ultimately, what you want to emerge from that with, I mean, according to the ICC, they prefer to operate by consensus, but you can pass an amendment with a 2/3 majority. And that will then put the crime into the document, and it means that the crime then exists. It doesn't actually mean it's enforced yet, but it means that it exists, and that in itself has huge moral power, because once you put ecocide alongside genocide, alongside crimes against humanity, what you're kind of saying with that, in terms of the message that you're giving, is that damaging nature is as bad as damaging people. And that starts to kind of, that has an effect on the kind of moral level that Kate also brought up earlier. The final stage is ratification, and that's when each country would actually submit an instrument of ratification to say that it agrees to enforce that amendment. And a year after doing that, it must also enforce it in its own country. And so there's probably a bigger power than some people maybe realize to this, in the sense that often when people think of the ICC, they think of it as prosecuting, you know, individuals specifically in The Hague at the ICC. But as Kate's outlined, that's only one aspect and should only happen as a last resort. And I think, again, with ecocide, there is a specific advantage that the other crimes don't perhaps have, in terms of the breadth of possible prosecutions, because, I mean, essentially, if you're a war criminal, the likelihood is that your own state is either not going to be in a position or not going to want to prosecute you, and therefore almost by default you're going to end up in the court of last resort. But with ecocide, most acts of ecocide are likely to be committed by corporations. I mean, obviously there's a lot of state-sponsored corporations too, but effectively you could be looking at much broader possibilities of prosecution within the states of either the victims or the perpetrators, and so on. So it creates a much broader scope. And just a brief sort of summary. So in a sense, you know, each of these steps, you know, creates a whole, you know, sort of new level of possibility and sort of evolution of this conversation, if you like, around ecocide. And I think it's probably worth just giving a little update as to where we are in terms of the political traction that this concept is getting. So we already have 6 ICC member states which have expressed to differing degrees have expressed at government level interest in taking this forward as a conversation at the international crime level, and those are Vanuatu and the Maldives, who in December 2019 called for serious consideration of ecocide at the International Criminal Court's annual assembly. It also includes France, where President Macron had very specifically described ecocide as being a battle that is the mother of all battles. For this is at the international level, he said in June last year, and that he would support leaders being held to account at the International Criminal Court for it. We then have Belgium, which incorporated the pledge to take diplomatic action around ecocide crime into its government programme, and in December just gone became the first European country to raise the issue in its official statement at the International Criminal Court. We then have Finland, which in the last, just a month ago, the Finnish foreign minister contributed to a side event that Kate spoke at, which we held in parallel with the Assembly of State Parties of the International Criminal Court. And it was an official side event because it was hosted by Vanuatu. And the foreign minister of Finland gave a short speech supporting Vanuatu and the Maldives and expressing Finland's interest in pursuing this conversation. And then most recently, before Christmas, we had Spain. There was a Parliamentary Foreign Affairs Committee which passed a resolution recommending that the government seriously examine the possibilities of legislating for ecocide nationally and internationally. And any moment now, I'm going to remember the 6th. And we also have the Pope, who spoke out in November 2019 around specifically called for ecocide to be made a 5th international crime against peace. And most recently, just give me a moment. Just last week, we have support also from the European Parliament. So unexpectedly, an amendment was made to a report that was dated from 2019, which was being discussed at the European Parliament. And it was a report on human rights and development. And an amendment had been submitted to that report by a Green MEP to encourage the European Parliament to support the moving forward of ecocide at the International Criminal Court and to encourage EU member states to do so. And that amendment was passed. And we literally heard about this 2 days ago. So as you can see, there's a huge movement internationally and politically towards talking about ecocide and discussing it as a possible international crime. Now, Anya, if you could move to the next slide, that would be great. Thank you. It's important to look at what are the things that get in the way of this discussion. And we're always asked, who are the people who object? What are your biggest obstacles? And in reality, we don't have, it's very rare that I actually encounter anybody who thinks on a one-to-one basis that this crime is a bad idea. There, I'm sure, are some detractors for very specific reasons. But by and large, when one speaks to people about destruction of ecosystems, it's really rare that anybody thinks this is a good thing. The obstacles are really those of mindset. So the Western tradition is very strongly dualistic. I mean, you can go right back as far as Plato. You can see the contrast between the ideal and the real. You move that forward to the Catholic Church. You see the split between spirit and body. You move it forward to the age of the Enlightenment, and you have, again, this split between reason and nature, or reason and emotion. And so this is very deeply ingrained dualism that runs as a thread through the whole of the Western way of thinking. And that has enabled the whole kind of colonial project to develop as a kind of dominant approach, as an approach of humans dominating nature, as nature being other, and as humans being able to treat nature as a kind of resource that is ultimately treated as though it's infinite. And the whole mindset creates a world in its own image. So effectively, if you have a dominating, what you create is a system where you have, one sector that dominates another sector. And indeed, we now have a situation where a relatively small number of particular global powers or particular corporations have vastly disproportionate power and treat both the ecosystems and other people as a kind of a resource. And so it's this kind of, what we're really looking at is kind of shifting a mindset. And where we can find potentially inspiration around this is particularly from the indigenous world, who have understood, since time immemorial, that we're deeply engaged and involved and interdependent with the natural world. And that effectively, when you have that perspective of harmony, then that is also what you're able to manifest in the world in terms of interacting with the natural systems around us. And it's no accident that 80% of the world's biodiversity is stewarded by indigenous communities, by regions, in regions that are stewarded by indigenous communities. And so a lot of what we're working with in terms of the narrative around this is actually kind of shifting that understanding to one which actually reflects reality, because as the Indigenous are well aware, and as perhaps ironically our spiritual leaders are now pointing out, is that we are deeply connected with nature, and that's actually a reality. That's a fact. You know, it's not something that we have to sort of make up or make a decision about. It's a fact. Whereas the leaders of our political world and our corporate world, who are supposedly have their roots in the, you know, sort of scientific fact and so on, are actually, it's not to put too fine a point on it, peddling a kind of a faith in a system that doesn't actually any longer function. And I think that because these are the kinds of obstacles that we're looking at, what we're really working on in terms of moving this forward is around how people think and around the narrative. And I think, and Kate touched on this earlier as well, but the most important concept here is actually this one word, ecocide. Because when you speak to people, everybody has a kind of understanding that there is serious damage and destruction taking place in many different areas. So whether that's overfishing, whether that's deforestation, whether that's greenhouse gases, there are all these different arenas where nature is being damaged to a serious extent. And so, you know, crystallizing that into this one concept is actually really quite important. And Anya, if you could just pop the next slide on, that would be great. And this is this little image is actually, it's actually known as a strange attractor, and it's a mathematical concept. And it's this kind of idea that you have, that there are certain numbers that, or there's certain aspects of, in the mathematical world that attract other numbers to them. And this is a way that I believe this is something that I believe happens with the word ecocide and the concept of ecocide. It creates a kind of almost a magnetic attraction, and a way of conceptualizing these different forms of damage. And I think the really powerful thing about that is that when people, at the same moment that people kind of understand that there is a term that can be used to crystallize all of these kinds of damage into one concept, they also understand at the same time that it's wrong and that it needs to be stopped. And so there's this kind of, you know, dual power of that word and that concept, which is extremely powerful. And that is what is really starting to take hold now in the kind of public consciousness, if you like. And also it's what we're finding parliamentarians are latching onto as well, in terms of wanting to do something about it. So we're contacted by parliamentarians saying, so what is this ecocide thing? You know, tell us about it. You know, how should we be addressing this? And those kinds of contacts are increasing, so that we actually have, you know, another, you know, parliamentarians from a further 10 states who are interested in seeing the definition that the legal drafting panel comes up with over the next few months, and they're actively wanting to know how that is going to proceed. And part of what we're actually engaging in terms of the drafting process is actually a public consultation. So actually everybody watching this session can also potentially take part in that consultation. And that's something you can find a link to that on our website. If you look up the expert drafting panel, you can see a link through to that consultation, which is literally just launched a couple of days ago, with some very specific questions around, you know, different aspects that Kate's outlined about the drafting of the law. And we will of course be consulting state parties themselves around this as well, so that there's you know, an engagement going on across different sectors of society, and specifically with state parties, who are the ones who can take that forward. And I think the other thing to really focus on, and if I could just move on to the next slide, that would be great. And that is something that I believe is changing, and that we're seeing as a campaign, we're seeing this changing in recent years. And that is the direct impact that the grassroots conversation is having at the political level. So part of what we would accredit the increase in discussion around ecocide in the media and in society at large is due to civil mobilization. So Greta Thunberg's inspired school strikes, for example, Extinction Rebellion's actions, the Sunrise Movement in the US. So all these civil mobilizations that have been happening around climate over the last year and a half have made a huge difference to the conversation at the political level, because what they've done, and you know, a lot of times it can be polarizing, not everybody necessarily agrees with, you know, blockading streets, for example, but what it has done is it's created a window of conversation. It's widened the window of conversation so that more and more people are talking about ecocide, and so that more and more people are talking about climate change, about ecological emergency, and that global conversation has expanded into the mainstream media. So what we're finding as a knock-on effect is that things that we have been saying for half a dozen years, 10 years, you know, are now being heard and being talked about in the mainstream. And this kind of, we're also seeing where we have campaigns on the ground in different countries, and we now have campaigns in half a dozen countries, where we're seeing where those campaigns are evolving and that grassroots conversation is developing, we're also seeing the political conversation move forward. So the two things are very closely related. And that sort of direct pressure, if you like, and impetus from the grassroots and from the conversation in society at large to the political sphere is happening more and more obviously. And what in a way we're finding is that, you know, the politicians are the ones that are kind of being dragged along by the public conversation in this. And so what that underlines is the importance of the grassroots conversation. And particularly for the Stop Ecocide campaign, we find ourselves at this kind of intersection between the grassroots conversation, the legal developments, and the political and diplomatic developments. And that's a really interesting place to be. And it's quite an unusual place for one sort of organization to sit. But it's really making it clear to us how those different sides interact, and how that sort of creating and stirring and nurturing that conversation that happens between those sectors. It has been a major aspect of what Margaret and Anya would call our policy entrepreneurship. And finally, if I can move on to the last slide, that would be great. This is perhaps a slightly puzzling title here. It's not meant to refer to a model agency. It's meant to refer to showing how to do things, not how to get things done, should we say, agency in the sense of actually moving things forward. And I believe that those who are interested and attending a masterclass like this, and those who are on the networks that Margaret and Anya are encouraging, may have an interest very specifically in this, because I believe, and I think it's quite interesting actually, when I was looking for sort of slides to illustrate this part of what I wanted to say, it was very, very difficult to find an image that fitted it. And what it made me realize was that in our culture, we're sort of, kind of brought up is the right word, but we're sort of acculturated perhaps, not to take real kind of ownership of our own power to act. And I think that is something that is changing. And I think that is something that our campaign specifically engages with, which is kind of knowing or looking at where one is trying to get to, and looking at the ingredients around us to see what can actually enhance that journey, and then applying that in a kind of very direct way. Now, our culture tends to, it's funny actually, do you know what, I'm going to ask Anya to do something a bit unusual here. Can you just put it back to me instead of the slideshow? Thank you. Sorry. Okay, so here's a little drawing. Can you all see that little drawing? Yeah. So let's say here we are, we want to get from here to here. But actually, where most of us end up is somewhere in here. This is like a big cloud. And it's a big cloud of finding a job, having prestige, feeling like you've got a place in a particular arena, and how you might be viewed by people in that arena, how people normally do things in a sort of perhaps quite a bureaucratic way, or all the sorts of, feels like almost a kind of chaotic, complex mixture of how we're acculturated to think we need to interact with the world. Now, all of that feels a little bit in order to, we're doing this in order to get to something else. Whereas when we want to see something change or happen fast, it has something to do with not being concerned with that, but looking at what are the ingredients that reach us to that point, and simply it's interesting. I mean, like there's a term that's sometimes used in entrepreneurship. It's called kind of bootstrapping. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that term, but it's like what we've done with this campaign is take what is happening around us and make a story out of that, and use that to build it to the next stage of engagement with the different arenas that we're dealing with. Now, I'm going to just give you a little example. So France, for example, is turning out to be very interesting, almost as a sort of pilot scheme for how a way of thinking about what's been happening in France. But the French Citizens Assembly talked about ecocide law. They said they submitted that as one of the top proposals that they wanted to happen. When Macron asked them, give us some climate policies then, if you don't like ours. And so they submitted a whole bunch of policies. Ecocide law came out pretty much top. 99% voted for it. Macron didn't want to really have to do anything about it, is my suspicion, and stand correctable, but he was cornered. He was cornered by his own climate assembly and by political circumstance at the time. And what he said was, we'll look at it nationally, but we really think this big battle is international. Now, that's a classic example of a head of state or a government sort of not wanting to act on their own turf, because if they have to do something quickly, they're going to be antagonizing business interests and so on. And whereas if they say they'll support it at the international level, it feels politically safer. But of course, they did have to do something about it nationally. And recently, they came out with a new law in France for ecocide, but it doesn't cover what Kate and the panel are working on in terms of an atrocity level crime. It's a sort of a bit of a serious version of, localized pollution events, for example. And that was a great disappointment to the Climate Assembly, because what they had asked for was a serious level crime at kind of international atrocity level. That was how they were conceptualizing ecocide. And so what we did when we heard about that is we publicized immediately that had happened, and that there was actually a debate here, that this was a controversy, that this wasn't just a situation of saying, hooray, France is legislating for ecocide. It was a situation of saying, well, hang on a minute, what do we really mean by this? Don't we mean a bigger question than this? We brought out that press release, we translated it into French, we got it into the French press, or we got that information into the French press, so that what came out that week in France was actually a debate. It wasn't just a celebration that would have completely, agreed with how the government was issuing that information. And as a result, the whole conversation around ecocide expanded massively in France. And so effectively, there's this sort of way in which one can observe what's happening around and use the elements that are arriving to move in the direction that we need to move in. And so I feel that this kind of, and I mean, that's just an example of what I sort of internally call, for myself, I sort of call bootstrapping. And I think that this is a kind of example of not necessarily sort of buying into the narrative that is being fed, but actually constantly keeping in mind, what is the goal that we have to get to? And the goal that we have to get to is the expansion of this conversation and the integrity of that goal in terms of making sure that something is taken seriously enough to move to the international level. And so there's a kind of intervention that we're able to do at that point because of having that perspective. And that's about not getting caught up in that cloud. Sorry, it's a bit of a slightly blue sky in here. I wasn't expecting to do this, but yeah. So that's the kind of idea that I'm wanting to sort of with this, and I think there's a way in which this can happen in many different arenas, not just this arena, but I think with ecocide law, because we're kind of at the cutting edge of something in terms of what's happening here. This is not something that's been in place before, it's something new, and the way that things are developing is something new, is also a response to the threat that we're seeing on a global level is also something new. So we have to be able to think about new ways of approaching something, and I think that actually arises very much in the moment from what we see happening around us. So there's a way in which looking at the specific goal that we're aiming at and having that very clear and very specific is really important, but being attached to exactly how that happens is not so helpful. So effectively having a kind of specific idea as to the what, but a real kind of openness as to the how actually enables new conversations and new ways of approaching things to emerge. And I'm kind of taking a bit of a risk here, going out on a limb, because I've not had this conversation in any of the sessions that I've done before. And I'm really grateful for Anya and Margaret for actually sort of throwing things like the idea of policy entrepreneurship into the mix, because I think it does allow some new arenas. But I think that, yeah, I've got a feeling that this kind of principle is something that we're going to see a lot more of, certainly from people like yourselves who are watching this, who have that kind of appetite to really open up new areas for discussion and move them forward at the political level. And I also think that we're seeing a disproportionate sort of success in terms of the result of what's happening, at the level of the global narrative. And there's something in that around being aligned with the goal that we're heading for, but not necessarily being constrained by some of those concerns that I think end up in that huge big cloud, which is where everybody seems to end up getting bogged down. Again, I'll give one last little example before I stop, because I've been going on a bit of a long time. But I spoke to someone who's very experienced in the environmental arena, especially with NGOs, and was talking about funding, about getting in some funding to do some PR stuff. And what she said to me was, if you want to get external communications, well, you need to get your funding in place first. Yes, you need to get a legacy, or you need to get, some serious major investment before you even decide, what your strategy and your communication strategy is. And I remember reading this that she sent to me, I'm thinking, that's insane. If we'd have started from that position, there's no way that we would have got as far as we've got. I mean, when I think that, kind of Polly and I worked for, Polly worked for 10 years, I worked for 5 years, all without salary, because what we were doing, I mean, I'm not saying everybody should work without salary, but we were lucky enough to have somebody that supported us. But what I'm kind of saying is that it was about what needed to happen, not about what is the structure for how this is usually done. And because when we looked at that, what we saw was nothing moving and everything being very slow, and people constantly getting distracted with, how do we tinker with this little edge of something that's already in place, when what we're actually facing is a massive global threat, and we need a corresponding response to it. So yeah, I'm just going to kind of leave you with that thought, I think, and open up to any further questions.
Wow, Jojo, thank you so much. Yes, Kate, for that, and also for linking in this thing about it's not what, it's about openness to the how of how we get there, and it resonates deeply with, I know, Anya and I, in terms of what we're trying to do with policy entrepreneurship. Let's look at the questions. We have lots, and a couple of the questions that I held back, I want to start with those because it deals specifically with, the campaigning and resistance to the idea of ecocide. John raised it earlier and Zoe has come in with it as well. They're asking, is there organized, well, John has said, who's preventing us rolling this out? Is there organized resistance against this idea of ecocide? And if you could tell us more. And Zoe also said, considering the idea of ecocide is attempting to hold corporations and states to account for environmental crimes and harms, as well as individuals, what sort of backlash have you received from those groups who may not want this legislation passed?
That's an interesting one. Because actually, very little is actually the response, very little backlash. And I think that comes down to a couple of different things. So one, it comes down to when you actually talk to anybody face to face on this. I mean, I've yet to meet somebody that actually thinks it's a good idea to allow serious ecosystem destruction. I mean, I just don't think that is the case. I mean, I think when people are responding badly to this, it's because they are set in a particular way of thinking around, usually around economics, and potentially, as you were mentioning earlier, and we addressed a little bit earlier, is around, for example, developing states that want to, go down the route that the so-called first world has gone down. But I think there are two things at play here. I mean, one is that if you're a nasty polluting company right now, let's say, I mean, up until now, you've basically been doing what you've been allowed to do. Okay, it's not like you've necessarily been sitting there rubbing your hands and stroking your white cat like a Bond villain saying, right, I'm going to go and destroy the world. You've been making money in the ways that you've been allowed to make it. And when someone comes along and points out that this is both practically and morally reprehensible, are you going to want to go very public with objecting to that? Are you really going to want to do that? I mean, how good is that going to make you look if you're like, I don't know, the head of Monsanto or the head of Shell or the head of whoever it is? Are you going to go and say, oh no, we don't like these people, they're saying something that we don't like? It's like, well, how, you're going to look really, really awful. I mean, I remember, I very first got into this actually via anti-fracking campaigning and anti-incineration, and I was kind of coming up against this big corporation as well as my local council, and it was actually Polly that said, look, Jojo, you don't have to worry, you can be as vocal as you like, because I can guarantee you that if they're talking to their lawyers are saying, don't touch her with a barge pole, because she will make such a meal out of anything you say that it's just not worth it. And I would say that's one reason why we haven't had a lot of very specific backlash. But I think there's another one, and that is to do with the sort of underbelly of how we're in this position globally. The whole fossil fuel thing, it's an addiction. It's like an addiction. Okay, so so that thing of when we're sort of saying to countries that are sort of developing and are sort of perhaps not at the same stage as some of the sort of Western dominant powers, can we please continue with our fossil fuel addiction? I mean, it's a bit like, if you find your brother is addicted to heroin, are you going to say, the first thing you're going to want to do is, okay, if you're addicted, we're going to have to make sure that you deal with this safely. So that's one of the things, ecocide law comes in, and you've at least got some restrictions around the safety and about the how you do things so that it doesn't create ecological destruction. But if somebody hasn't actually got into that yet, are you going to say, oh, well, yes, because I've been through being a complete junkie and now I've come out the other side, and I want to do things in a more healthy way. But oh my God, I understand. Of course, go be a junkie. I don't mind. No, you're going to look at that you can more healthily do something, and you're going to say, well, actually, there are healthier ways of doing this. Not only that are healthier, but they're cheaper, and they're going to make your population happier, because you've got to look at aspects like, when a head of state or those in power are saying, well, we don't want to do this because we want to be able to develop our economy in the way that you guys did. You also need those people to ask themselves themselves, what is their position in the world, and what is their position in relation to their own population. So are they wanting to develop, you know, oil and gas because oil and gas are going to make their population happy and make them healthy and make them stable? Or are they doing that because, you know, there's a certain, you know, political class and economic class that will benefit from that? You know, I think I don't want to dismiss in any way that there are practicalities around addressing that those things, you know, can approach each other. But I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that effectively, you know, we already know that any more fossil fuels taken out of the ground are already beyond dangerous. So, you know, are we going to say, yeah, be the junkie? But, you know, not only be the junkie, but be the junkie that's actually going to addict the, you know, keep the rest of us addicted. I don't know. That's my possibly strong view on that one.
Yeah, I want to jump in, but I do want to go on with some of the questions so we could get through as many as possible. Nieki, I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly. And if I'm not, please forgive me. Has asked a couple of questions around whether Stop Ecocide is doing any work around making this campaign accessible to children and young people. And is there a group brainstorming and envisioning what ecocide law can mean for the younger generations?
I think that's a lovely question. And I think that, I mean, we have some amazing young campaigners amongst our campaign, actually. I particularly give a shout out to Jamie Hunter in Canada on that, who was the one who brought the whole ecocide question into the mock COP convention that happened towards the end of last year, where there was a whole gathering of youth representatives from 140 countries around the world talking about what would be appropriate for a future that they would want to live in, and ecocide law figured strongly in that. And I think that, and this also true of Greta Thunberg and her colleagues have also highlighted ecocide law as a key root cause of what is going on in terms of the climate. So I think this conversation is starting to be very alive already in those arenas, in those groups of young people that are convening around climate and around ecological justice. And we would in no way have the sort of arrogance or patronizing attitude to say we would know how those conversations should be addressed in, you know, by the youth. But I think it's very, very clear and obvious that you know, that ecocide law is a directly sort of protective ground rule that could be put in place in regards to what kind of future our young people are going to be growing up into.
And thanks, Jojo. Rebecca is also asking a question around whether you see any overlap with working with the Green New Deal in terms of generating groundswell of interested parliamentarians in the UK.
Yes, I mean, in the sense that I think that any conversation around, you know, a green recovery or a Green New Deal should have, you know, crossover with the conversation around ecocide. I mean, I have to say that in the UK, this has not been a particularly loud conversation. I mean, it's been in, for example, it's been in the Green Party policy for many years, but it's not, that conversation is not yet being spoken about loudly in the UK. I mean, there is the Shadow Justice Minister has actually actively called for ecocide to become a crime, which is a fantastic endorsement. But there is definitely more conversation to be had, and I think this year we'll see quite a lot of that conversation emerging, because if we're going to be taken seriously hosting the COP talks, then, you know, we definitely need to be addressing ecocide in that run-up.
Cool. And Hillary's asking, can you please suggest good ways of engaging with people who don't see this as relevant to them?
Interesting. I think a lot of people do see law as being quite remote, and they don't necessarily, you know, they think law is something that's done by lawyers somewhere over there, and international law is even more remote, and international criminal law might as well be on the moon. So yeah, I think a lot of people don't necessarily relate directly to it when you speak about it in legal terms. But I think when you have a conversation around, you know, the level of destruction that's happening and the level of threat to the global environment and the direct threat that poses, then certainly in kind of on the ground conversations, we definitely see that engagement coming. I think the other thing is that I think one of the points that Kate made that is really, really important is the universal jurisdiction point. You know, the point that just because you're dealing with something at the International Criminal Court doesn't mean it doesn't apply or wouldn't apply in domestic legislation. It absolutely would, and that's part of the whole deal with the complementarity set up with the ICC. So I think you know, there is a way of making that immediate, and of course it depends also which country you're in or what kinds of ecocide are potentially relevant to the people that you're speaking to. So it's a little bit of an answer that could vary hugely depending on where people are.
And there's another question I think Rachel has raised, and I am going to come back to some of the other more legal questions and have Kate come into it. But let me just throw out this question that Rachel has just raised. How do we confront the role of consumerism and acts of everyday ecocide in a way that brings people on board in a positive way rather than creating defensiveness or helpless guilt? Jojo, I think you...
Yeah, I think, I mean, I've got quite strong views on that. I think that the corporate PR machine has done a fantastic job of making the person on the street feel guilty for things that are not actually in the control of the citizen. So, you know, I drive a fossil fuel car, not because I want to drive a fossil fuel car, but because I need to get from A to B and I can't afford anything else. I don't think I've ever spent more than a few £100s on a car. So, you know, that's because, and the, you know, the decisions about what kinds of vehicles are available at what prices and what, you know, where the subsidies go, those are decisions that happen at government level. They're decisions that happen at the level of the top of industry, and that is why a law of ecocide is so important. You know, if we're looking at the really, and also if we look at the really serious damage that's going on in the environment, you know, it's committed by a relatively small number of companies. It's, you know, the people will take choices that are offered to them, or options that are offered to them, and, you know, unless you're extremely wealthy, a lot of the options that are offered to you are actually not particularly ecologically friendly, and that's not your choice. I mean, you might want to make those choices, but you actually need to be quite well off to be able to uphold those choices. And I don't think that's fair. I don't think it's fair at all to be laying that on individual citizens. However, of course, I do believe that everybody has a responsibility to do everything they can. But I just think there's an acknowledgement here that, you know, the real damage is not being done at the level of end users.
Yeah, I would like to bring Kate in. Okay, you wanted to say something?
I wanted to say something about the obstacles, actually, because I mean, and you just mentioned again the corporate regime, Jojo, and my slightly more pessimistic view is that we haven't seen massive pushback because this is only just blown up. I mean, it's only just come out of the you know, activist environmental NGO circles, really. I mean, I encountered, as I told you, I spent some years, you know, thinking about how to approach this from an international criminal law point of view. And there were not many of my colleagues that didn't roll their eyes when I talked about ecocide and protecting the environment, you know, at the beginning. And there are far fewer of them now, but it's not been like that, it's been like that, you know. And I feel like this is a zeitgeist thing. It's so exciting. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it's just exploding. I mean, the way Jojo has said, but so I think we are going to see pushback. We just haven't seen it yet because nobody's realised what a threat it is. And I'm very curious to see what the corporate PR machines are going to start pushing out. And not just them, they're kind of government sponsors. So I'm living in the US, and I occasionally watch Fox News. I mean, I have to grit my teeth, clearly. But after the inauguration, I wanted to see what they said. And oh my God. So Fox News is like, they were outraged. They're scoffing at the executive orders that are stopping Arctic drilling and cancelling the pipeline. And, you know, there's talking head after talking head talking about the jobs that are going to be lost, the massive, you know, how Joe Biden doesn't care about the American people. All these people are going to be out of work. I mean, that was within a couple of hours, that narrative was up and running. And, you know, I think we're going to see that. And I'd be interested, you know, let's all be on the alert for it. Yeah, basically, because surely it's going to come.
Yeah, it's a neoliberal mindset, and it operates with leaders across the globe. And so, yeah, definitely. Just let's see how many more questions we can squeeze in. There's one from Emil Holland about the Volkswagen scandal, Dieselgate, and would that have any fit under ecocide in terms of intent? I think a little while ago, a couple of years ago, there was a Volkswagen emission scandal. Do you remember it?
Yeah, sorry, I was just distracted by somebody's comment about the parallel universe in Fox. Yeah, really. But you know, what was it? 70 million votes. I mean, it's scary. Parallel but real. So the Volkswagen diesel thing, would that be? You know, it's interesting in a way. Coming to this drafting project, you know, there are a number of ways we could do it. We could either do it from kind of principles, or we could do it from thinking about examples, you know, or a combination of the two, like running some classic famous examples through our definition and see what would be caught and what wouldn't be caught. In terms of so I don't know about the Volkswagen diesel thing. Of course, it depends how we end up. If we just focus on the intent, I say that intent would be caught, right? Because there was a deliberate intent to do the actual act. I mean, the tinkering with the metering, whatever it was. And there was surely a knowledge about what would occur in the normal course of events in terms of the kinds of emissions that would, you know, that would, or the pollution that would result in. But yeah, whether something like that would amount to my sense is that wouldn't, I mean, just off the top of my head, my sense is that wouldn't be big enough to be an international crime of ecocide, that the scale of gravity and destruction of the environment would have to be higher. But that's just, you know, off the top of my head.
Okay, we have a really interesting one from Paula. Are you planning to add a system or an instrument into the proposal that includes compensation/damages? As you mentioned, to date, the fund attached to the ICC is not quite there, yet the repair to damaged environments can be hugely costly and long-term.
Yeah, great point. I see a lot of potential in that. I mean, that's why I drew attention to the compensation provision, which I'm guessing you're already familiar with at the ICC, because this is obviously something which causes such massive damage that compensation is very relevant. You know, we have to work within the framework of the statute, and given that compensation is already provided for in the statute, I would think that it would be more productive for us to, you know, think separately about supporting that, or at least to connecting to that in an obvious way, rather than carve out some different kind of provision for compensation. And you can also imagine, I mean, a population that suffered genocide, you know, would also feel pretty entitled to compensation. So I think it's fantastic that the ICC statute has that in there. It's not working properly. I think it's a very worthwhile thing to put time, energy, and thought into. And I think the ecocide provision would, you know, should link into what's already there.
Okay, thank you. So I'm smiling because Anya sent me a question. I don't know if Anya wanted to ask it directly.
I do. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to use that privilege to be a host of the meeting, I guess. You were mentioning the genocide again, and I can't help but making all these analogies. Like, those crimes were prosecuted and we knew exactly who to prosecute. I mean, there were people that, you know, we wanted to prosecute at the court, and I'm just hearing Jojo saying that there's not many corporations out there, that we actually have a few names that we might be prosecuting as well. So is there like a list of all these perpetrators to pursue at court once this crime is recognized? Do we have that list already? I know that, I mean, that might, you know, remain a secret, so I don't mind, but
it's not a secret.
Okay.
Someone might have that list. It sounds like an important list. I don't have that list. What about you, Jojo?
Well, it's an interesting one. I mean, we're often asked, you know, who would you like to see in the doc? You know, that's kind of, it's often one of the first questions we get from journalists. But actually, I mean, you know, my response is always, you know, we don't actually want to see anyone in the dock. We want to see them changing their practices so that they're not in the dock. And I think the thing with corporations, particularly the large corporations, I mean, I don't know, I mean, I'm just, again, give an example. You know, we spoke with people who are in the Shell Renewables department a while back, and they, you know, they were detailing some incredible projects that were being undertaken. They're just not being focused on because they're still allowed to carry on with business as usual, capable of doing with the, you know, moving into the renewable sphere. And what this ground was coming, you've got 5 years or however long we want to guess it's going to take, and it shouldn't be shouldn't be that long. And let's say, you know, you've got a 5-year period, you know, you've got your think tanks, you've got your strategy groups, you know, you've easily got the finance to look at this. How are you going to do it? How are you going to turn it around? And if you don't, are you really going to sit there and say, you know, the world went to hell because we couldn't be bothered, even though we're like one of the top corporations in the world? It's like, you know, this is an opportunity. We've got to frame it as an opportunity. If we frame it as a we're getting you because you're the bad guys, we don't take people with us. We've got to take everybody with us on this. This is a challenge, and it's a challenge for everybody together. And that includes particularly that shortlist. I want that shortlist in a room. I want that shortlist in a room, and I want, there's this massive challenge and this massive global threat, but also for the first time in history, and you know, and obviously from a massive perspective, this is really horrible, but let's put those guys in a room and say, okay, you guys actually have more power, concentrated power, than anybody in history has ever had. What are you going to do with that? What are you going to be on your deathbed thinking about? You know, are you seriously going to say that you didn't save the world because you couldn't be bothered, when actually, for the first time in history, this group of people has the power to make a really serious fundamental difference?
Incredible. Guys, I'm looking at the other questions, and I want you all to know I'm taking an editorial decision to press pause on the questions here, because a couple of the questions I'm seeing that we have left to answer have been answered by Kate and Jojo during the course of the class. And so we can check it on the recording and all of that. Any final comments from Kate and Jojo? I was really pleased to hear about the public consultation that you all are doing, and we will certainly be driving all of our people to contribute, and perhaps we can establish a process whereby those who are in this group can submit, but also can agitate their members of parliament and their leaders to submit, you know, to get some of these views, these diverse views. Because, I mean, I want to sound off on what Kate said, because in my circles as well, I didn't get as positive a reaction as you've experienced, Jojo, when talking about ecocide. And that's why I think the diversity of views in your public consultation would be so incredible. So I don't know if we could just get last words from everyone, and then I will close it up. Thank you so much for everyone who's been asking all of the questions. Promise, if your question hasn't been answered and you disagree with my editorial, feel free to join the WhatsApp group and we will answer it in there. And Jojo and Kate are in there. So you first, Jojo, or?
Yeah, sure. It's been a hugely enjoyable discussion. And yeah, as I say, I think I've took a few risks in terms of the things I don't normally talk about. So thank you for giving me that opportunity. And yeah, look forward to more conversation on the WhatsApp group.
Okay.
Yeah, me too. Thank you both so much. And I just want to reiterate, or maybe say for the first time, I don't know if we made it completely clear, but this ecocide is a tiny thing. All the other big efforts are important, and I think this is why you focused in on it, Margaret and Anya, it could be a tipping point for all the reasons that Jojo just outlined. So, yeah, you know, let's go there.
Yeah, that narrative. Anya, you wanted to say anything?
Oh, first off, thank you. Thank you so much for joining this conversation. I know that we already had a talk. We met in person. I hope to see you, Kate, in person as well, sometime when the COVID is over or whatever. But yeah, thank you so much for the insights. I look forward to having more of these discussions, and I'm amazed by the improvisation that we experienced today. I'm very much glad that we didn't just stick to the PowerPoints that we had. It's been awesome. So thank you so much for all the answers.
Yeah, and thank you, everyone. I do want to say something, though. I mean, I have been, when I first got introduced to the concept of ecocide, I mean, I watched a TED talk like Kate. And I thought, yeah, that's really cool, but environmental law wasn't my background. And so I was like, yeah, that's great, wonderful. Then, you know, we started doing work in future law, looking at systemic approaches. You know, how do we create the infrastructure for the laws and policies that would give us a more just and a safer and ecologically resilient future. And I met Jojo. And when Jojo started talking to me about ecocide, and you all have heard it tonight, you all have heard it this evening, it's very inspirational, it's very passionate. And for those of us who take action, I think intuitively, I knew that this was the right thing to do. I then engaged in some consultations around this issue in my network and all of that. And there was some pushback on it. And I had to think it through myself, when looking at the development of certain later industrial states and their reliance on the fossil fuel industry, and what a crime would mean if it were put in place immediately. What would the immediate impact be on the quality of lives of human beings? And in my reflections, it came to me, because I was starting to really grapple with it, go back and forth with it. It came to me that the arguments that some states might be proffering around the economics of fossil fuel industry and how it positively impacts the quality of lives of their citizens would probably be the same kinds of arguments that were used by the slaveholders, the slave owners in the slave trade, because it was legal to involve yourself in the slave trade. It was legal to dehumanize human beings and use it as property. And I feel that we're at the same moment in history right now where it is legal to destroy the planet. And for those of us who are beginning to learn more about the interconnectedness of all things and have a systems view of life and our relationship with the planet, then if we are harming the planet, we're harming us. But you don't even have to get there. You're harming the planet. This is part of our system. This is who we are. And so I want to thank Kate and Jojo, and for all of you who have plugged in this evening for this very important discussion, because I feel, we are on the right side of history. It's very difficult, I think, in some quarters to advance this discussion, right? It's very much like that time of trying to say, no, it's wrong. There's something wrong here that we have to just stop and eradicate, and only a criminal law can demonstrate or can feed that narrative, which I think is so important here. So I'm really grateful for being part of this discussion, Jojo and Kate, and to support the work that you all are doing in every way. So thanks everyone for coming to this masterclass, and join us on the WhatsApp. And we share the link to the consultation, because everyone here probably has lots of stuff to share with Kate and Jojo and that panel. Stop ecocide.earth/public-consultation.
That's one. And we're also going to be sharing the recordings to this masterclass. It's going to be published on Flix platform. Everybody's going to get an email. And what you just said, Margaret, I mean, I'm sorry to extend this talk, but it just triggered my memory of how we met, because years ago I went to study in Beijing. It was international law that I wanted to study, and I was choking on the smog while studying it. And at that time, I kind of decided not to really pursue the international law and to become a normal lawyer, but rather just went into all the weird stuff, all the crypto law, all the space law, whatever, just that it wasn't connected to my own jurisdiction and to the international law per se. And I think that global conception and that weirdness of the legal studies actually led me to you directly, because we met when you organized the Global Challenges Retreat, and that is where we started talking about all these threats that now lead to policy entrepreneurship. So I'm just so happy to see how all these puzzles today are coming together, and how we, are creating this network of all these people. I'm happy to invite you to the Flix platform to really watch the recordings again. And we're also going to be sharing the handout, the presentation, and the resources. So I'm going to be saving the chat because I saw that there were incredible links shared today. And I hope to share them both in WhatsApp group and over the emails. But yeah, absolutely a pleasure to be with you today.